Well, welcome everyone to our first teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar of the new academic year. Saturday I always look forward to get started on our great conversations. Our Saturday webinars are sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and History and co-director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students here at Ashland University. The theme of our webinar series this year is Great American Debates. And if you happen to be joining us for the first time, welcome. But the point of this is to pull together some very thoughtful, knowledgeable scholars, and we happen to have two very good ones today, to have a conversation about a particular debate. And as always, we encourage others, if you're joining us, to participate in our conversation by submitting questions in the chat feature. And as always, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. And encourage my panelists, by the way, joining us. If you see a question pop up and you want to go right to it, feel free to do so. You don't have to wait for me to bring up a question from the chat feature. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, and that will also include a link to the archived video and audio of today's program. So, as always, with what we do at Ashbrook and teachingamericanhistory.org, we try to draw our conversations or base our conversations on original documents. And a lot of the documents we'll be using this year in our webinar series are drawn from two new volumes produced by the Ashbrook Center. We're producing a number of volumes with collections of great documents. And I think most of those, if not all of them, are available through on the teachingamericanhistory.org website in electronic form. Today, I think we happen to be drawing from one of the volumes that I believe was produced for West Point, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe Rob can say more about that, one of our panelists today. But the debate that we're focusing on today is Patriots versus Loyalists. And I'm happy to introduce two very thoughtful scholars joining me today. Rob McDonald of the United States Military Academy and Todd Estes of Oakland University. Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
Thanks for being here, especially on a Saturday morning. This is the first webinar of the year. I'm always, thinking about how do we start this? How do we start this not just this new theme, but this particular topic? So, Patriots versus Loyalists. That means we could talk about just about anything, right? I'm not sure where to go from there. So maybe my first question, or maybe a question or a couple of questions that hopefully you'll help us think through at some point today is, what do we mean by those terms, Patriots versus Loyalists? Were those terms that both sides used to describe the other side? Are those terms that were used at all during the Revolutionary period to describe themselves? And maybe a related question, did the meaning of those terms change during the course of the Revolution? That is, did what it meant to be a patriot or a loyalist change at all during the Revolutionary period? But in general, I guess maybe you could help us work through the arguments of both sides. What were the kinds of things that patriots were arguing for? And what were the kinds of arguments that loyalists were making? But I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially on the terms themselves. Were those terms that were actually used during the time, or those terms, those labels applied by historians at a later point? But of course, as always, gentlemen, feel free to ignore my questions and talk about anything you want to talk about, which is probably much more interesting. So anybody want to start with thoughts on this or anything else related to the topic? Please feel free.
Todd, I'll let you go first.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. I think. Well, I guess one of the things about Patriots and Loyalists, I think those terms were used a little bit in that day. However, they really have come to become sort of defining terms that have been used by historians and subsequent people in thinking about the founding of the American Revolution, and they've been defined in specific ways. But one of the things that I've always found most fascinating about this whole question of loyalists and loyalism is that the presumption today, and I think for really pretty much every decade since the American Revolution, has been that the loyalist position somehow needs to be explained because it's abnormal and because it's strange and because it's illogical. That the idea of staying loyal to Great Britain and loyal to the crown was somehow obviously the position that lost out in the revolution. And so no one asked the question, why did people become patriots? Why did people support the American Revolution? Why were people in favor of independence? But they do ask, and I think for generations, historians have asked the question, what would make someone a loyalist? Why would you stay a loyalist? What was inside the loyalist mind, if you will, that kept them loyal to the crown even very, very late and then into the revolution itself? And so I think one of the things we need to do is go back and understand that loyalism at the time, in the 1760s and 70s, I think you can make a very good case that that made really good sense. That was a logical position. It was rational. It certainly was a realistic position. And it was also in many ways a kind of moderate position, certainly compared to the Patriots and what they were trying to do. And so that's not trying to explain away or defend loyalists necessarily, or to be a partisan in favor of the loyalists. I'm not suggesting that. But I do think it's important to try to go back and understand what it was about the loyalist that would make someone a loyalist, because that's often presumed that loyalists were strange people and we can sort of write them out of the story of the American Revolution. But by sheer numbers, by impact, by wealth, by land holdings, by office holdings, and things like that, the loyalists were pretty prominent people and pretty important people. And I think to explain away their behavior or write them out of the story and say, well, they're not that significant, or whoever was a loyalist was strange, why wouldn't they be patriots? I think really not only misunderstands the history of the American Revolution as it happened, but I think it also does a real disservice to it's very ahistorical thinking, I guess I would say. It sort of implies our position now of trying to figure out, why would you be a loyalist and not a patriot? Don't you know that the Patriots created the revolution, declared independence, fought the war, established the United States of America? That's the right position. Why would you be against that? And I think that, again, sort of rips the loyalist out of the context of the time. So hopefully what we'll try to do this morning in our conversations and questions and through these readings is to try to figure out what made people loyalists and what they believed in, but also to try to understand that that was not a strange choice or strange behavior at the time.
Yeah, I think what Todd is saying about contextualizing these people is really important, and it's worth noting, I think, that all of these documents that we're reading for our gathering this morning come from the year 1774. So I think in 1774, all of these people would describe themselves not as patriots or as loyalists, but as Englishmen. And I think that comes through loud and clear in the documents. There's a great deal of agreement between these people who will subsequently become loyalists and subsequently become patriots. Sure, you could look at Thomas Jefferson's summary view and certainly see the direction in which he's heading. I mean, he's sort of on the vanguard of the movement for some sort of separation from Great Britain. But then when you look at the letter by Gouverneur Morris talking about, the riotous mob, he sounds, to our ears like he should be a loyalist. But in fact, he's going to become a patriot as well. And then when you look at the two gatherings where toasts were given, the first is a group of loyalists who are trying to celebrate the anniversary of the repeal of the Stamp Act, which had occurred 8 years earlier, so that they could ignore the imposition of the Intolerable Acts, which had occurred just a couple of months earlier. But in many respects, their toasts overlap significantly with those that were given at the banquet in honor of the convening of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. I think, once you do declare independence, you begin to see names applied to these two separate groups of people. Probably not patriots and loyalists, though. I mean, I think the people we would call patriots would describe the loyalists as Tories. And the people we would describe as Tories would describe the patriots as rebels. So as Todd pointed out, these are terms that have kind of, come into their own in subsequent decades as historians sort of look for neutral terms to apply to these two groups.
And Rob, can I just, for clarification, so that those terms would have been tossed around much more around 1776? and post 1776.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly do see people describing each other as rebels and Tories, and I think you would find people who are on the Patriot side, they would describe themselves as patriots, and sure, loyalists would describe themselves as being loyal to Great Britain.
Right.
But I think it's worth pointing out that certainly in 1774, the one thing that all of these people could agree upon was that Great Britain was the richest and the most powerful, and not coincidentally, the freest nation on the planet.
Right.
And so the real debate is, can we, within this great British framework, recover the liberties that we believe have been injured, since the end of the French and Indian War?
Yeah, no, that's really well put. I'd love to push this question you've raised further. It seems like the central question, especially in 1774 and in the years around there, is what does it mean to be an Englishman, right? I'd love to push that question further, because that will also get us into that realm of what Todd was suggesting about what were the arguments that the Tories, as they were later called, the Loyalists, what were the arguments that they were actually making? And I was surprised when I first dug into these, some of the arguments of the Loyalists several years ago, at the fact that they do make arguments in favor of remaining loyal to an empire, especially, right? They talk about a lot of times about the importance of the empire and how important it is as an Englishman to be tied to the greatest empire in the world that is doing all these great things. But we can hopefully get into some of those arguments in much more depth, because again, I'll stop talking here in a second. The stereotype I was always taught growing up was that the Loyalists were just sort of, they didn't really think that deeply about the issues. They were just sort of bound by tradition, and that led to their loyalty to the government that they were born and raised into. But I think it's much deeper than that. But I love the label of Tories, Rob, as you mentioned, because after 1776, that's an older term, right? Tories were traditionally supporters of the king, stretching back to the English Civil War. So does that reflect a turn in the mind of American patriots, moving away from sort of blaming Parliament and toward moving toward being more anti-monarchical and blaming the king? Would that help explain why the label of Tory came to be so prominent after 1776? But
I think so. Yeah. I mean, we should keep in mind that the political terms of the day that were bandied about principally were Whigs and Tories, and I think that all of the people whose writings we see represented here in these four documents would consider themselves among the Whigs. The Whigs traditionally had been opposed to the centralization of power. They certainly, on the question of America, had been, more amenable to the arguments coming from the American colonists regarding their rights and their liberties and their grievances against British imperial policy. And so, after independence, to label a group of people Tories, was a real insult, because they were with the really bad guys back in Britain. And it's kind of interesting. And when you look at the toasts that are given in celebration of the convening of the Continental Congress, there are a couple of ones that reference the British Parliament. One is the 10th, and the person who raised his glass said, "May the cloud which hangs over Great Britain and the colonies burst only on the heads of the present ministry." That would be the Tories. That would exclude the Whigs.
I see. Gotcha. Yeah, I was thinking of that the letter too that Jefferson later wrote to Henry Lee, explaining the mindset, where he uses the phrase about the American mind, and he says all Whigs thought alike, right? All American Whigs thought alike. So that's a great connection, a great point that you raised.
Yeah, I think also, if I can just jump in, I think, as Rob said, I think people on both sides would have considered themselves clearly in the Whig camp. I mean, that's how they thought, that's how they would identify themselves. But there was a clear struggle in the 1760s and 70s over precisely what that term meant. And of course, it's been argued by a number of scholars who analyze intellectual history and these trends of the revolution that what the Patriots were actually in the process of becoming, of course, was Republicans, small r Republicans. And that was the trajectory of their thought. So they were really pulling away from the Loyalists, who it could be argued were Whigs before 1763 and well afterwards, but at a time when Patriots were turning away from that and making that move toward republicanism. And that sort of left them behind and left them adrift and left them in many ways profoundly confused about what was happening in their country, in the colonies, and in the British Empire. And as Rob noted, and as you noted as well, after not just the outbreak of the war, but particularly with the Declaration of Independence, it was no longer patriotic, if you will, to be a loyalist. I mean, at that point, you were part of the opposition, part of the enemy. And because of that, I think the term Tories came into use as a very negative, very pejorative term. And that's when you begin to see, again, the abuse toward loyalists, the seizing of their property, the flogging and the beatings and the tarring and featherings and the attacks on them, not only in person physically, but in the newspapers as well, to really just destroy loyalism as a legitimate position. And that was, again, the Loyalists, in many ways, they were profoundly confused by this because they kept thinking, wait a minute, we're all in this Whig tradition. What happened to you? And so the Loyalists were asked the question, what are our fellow colonists doing? How do you explain the Patriots? So I think, again, the timing is critical. And as Rob astutely noted, all these documents come from 1774, which is late in the revolutionary struggle, but it's obviously before the outbreak of the war, before Paine's Common Sense, and obviously before the Declaration. So we're at particular points here, and I think the chronology becomes increasingly important as we go from 1774 into 75 into 76 in thinking about the context of the revolution, but also about the course of loyalism and patriotism as well.
There's a really great book that I think I've actually heard Todd recommend. I know I've recommended it many times myself, but it's by the late author Pauline Maier, who was a historian at MIT, and her first book was called From Resistance to Revolution. And if I'm not mistaken, her final chapter's title is The Republican Transformation. And, exactly as Todd says, I mean, people had been holding out hope. People, on all sides of this debate in America had been holding out hope that, if nothing else, the king would put a stop to what they considered to be the tyrannical actions and edicts of the British Parliament. And when it becomes clear that that's not the case, those who are willing to take the plunge and support independence, well, they have to repudiate the king. I guess the question is, were they Republicans really before they had to take the step of repudiating the king? Or did the step of repudiating the king essentially force them into becoming Republicans? And I think, for different groups, for different people, there might be different answers. Just looking at, not being an expert on Gouverneur Morris, but just sort of the flavor and the tone of the document suggests that perhaps he was more comfortable with the British system of monarchy and aristocracy than, say, someone like Thomas Jefferson.
Right. Mm-hmm. So this is a really interesting distinction that we're sort of moving toward and perhaps hopefully going to work through this. Well, Todd mentioned that in many ways both sides would have considered themselves sort of the true heirs of sort of Whiggism, right, in that English sense. I guess maybe my question is, how did they see their? Let me put it this way, maybe. So you have the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, and the Whig way of thinking about things, if I understand history correctly here, emerges victorious in a certain sense. That is, you still have a monarchy. It's not necessarily Republican in the sense that Americans think of republicanism, and as Rob is pointing out, but there is the Whig way of thinking about things that emerges from the Glorious Revolution is one where the king is still important, has a significant role to play, but there are sort of constitutional restraints placed on the king. Am I understanding this correctly? And I'm curious about what the split might have been among those who considered themselves Whigs, or what was the difference between American Whigs and English Whigs? And if that doesn't make sense, just ignore it and again, talk about whatever you want. I'm trying to think this through. It's a tough question.
Well, I mean, I'll just jump in quickly, and then I want to hear what Rob says about this. I mean, I think in many ways that's a question that the colonists rarely had to think about prior to 1763 and the end of the Great War of Empire. I mean, they considered themselves part of the British Empire, certainly very, very loyal to the empire. They identified as Englishmen, as British. They took enormous pride, certainly, in everything the British Empire was accomplishing in Canada against the French and Native Americans, and then certainly with the post-war hubris of 1763 and the great achievement. It's really only at that point when the British began to say, well, we've got to rethink the empire now. It's much broader, much vaster, far more expensive to maintain. There's still the 9 years of war debt that we have. This is going to require some real thought about what the empire means. What does it mean to be in the empire? And what does it mean to be, in fact, British? And I think it's at that time that the colonists, for the most part, are sort of forced into thinking about, well, what does it mean? You know, what does it mean to be a colonist, to be loyal to the king? What's the relationship between our local legislative bodies and Parliament? What duties do we own or do we owe to Great Britain? What rights do we have? And so I think really none of that is an issue that very many people talk about or think much about prior to 1763 because they don't have to. And it's really only in the years after that, and especially in the years after 1765 and the Stamp Act, that the colonists began to go through really a decade of very intensive self-examination. And at the end of that, then they make the decision, obviously, that they would be better off independent, which, undoes a century and a half of Anglicization and a century and a half of becoming more and more enmeshed in the British Empire, in trade and commerce and manners and speaking and law and politics and everything else. And so it really forces them to define what they believe to be, what they think it means to be part of the empire. And then, of course, after 1776, they have a second and related problem of defining, well, okay, now that we're independent, what does it mean to be an American? Right. And how much of that American identity is going to be based on things they took with them out of their earlier British identities? So I think these are fascinating questions, but I would suggest they really don't get thought much about, or at least written much about, until kind of push comes to shove in the years after the Great War for Empire.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I really agree with what Todd is saying, and I would just extend it. I mean, both Todd and I have done most of our work not in the American War for Independence, strictly speaking, but in the 1790s. And I mean, I think that's when this question of what does it mean to be an American, and we knew what we were united against, but what do we really stand for? I mean, I think that becomes a primary concern. But going back in time a bit, let's say to 1763, when the French and Indian War comes to a close, it shouldn't be surprising for us as Americans to understand what Parliament was up to. During the course of this war, the 7 Years' War, as it was known globally, Britain's debt doubled. And in the final year of the war, in 1763, we know that Great Britain spent £384,000 on the American colonies and received in revenue from the American colonies only £1,800. There is a tremendous imbalance. And the British people were, in general, much more heavily taxed than the American people. So it's not a crazy thing that members of Parliament would try to pay for this last expensive war by turning toward the American colonies. The irony, of course, is that by doing so, and by ignoring some of their own basic principles about the importance of representation to people who are going to be taxed, the British set in motion a series of events that are going to yield yet another war that's even more expensive, and that this time around is not going to have a favorable outcome for them. So that great continental empire that they had achieved during the French and Indian War, a great portion of it is going to be lost in the War for Independence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's fascinating. So both sides, you can see how the split starts to emerge over, as you put it, Rob. On the one side, the British overlooked, and you do see these arguments coming out, especially between 1763. But I'd say really I see them prominently in the early 1770s, the fact that the British violated one of their sacred principles of British constitutionalism, which was representation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's that aspect of Whiggism as well that emerged out of the 1680s. But so you do start to see those arguments emerge mostly on the side of the Americans. They're violating a sort of sacred, traditional, what they would often call a natural right of Englishmen, right? A natural right of Englishmen to be represented and not be deprived of their property through taxes without representation. But on the other side, as you point out, the British, the English had strong grounds to argue that the American the British colonists in America had been more than happy to accept the protection and the aid and the money of the British during the 7 Years' War, as you put it, and it was only fair and just that they be willing to repay some very small portion of that, right? I mean, my understanding is the initial attempt to recover some of this through taxes was very non-invasive and very minuscule in a certain way. Thoughts on this, or?
Well, I'll just interject that the supreme irony is perhaps that the British would end up losing the empire that they had gained as a result of their efforts to tax the colonists. But maybe a secondary irony is that their efforts to tax the colonists were almost all unsuccessful. I mean, the amount of revenue that was raised as a result of the Stamp Act or the Townshend Acts was absolutely minuscule, in part because the colonists stuck to their guns and saw with such clarity the sacred principle that there should be no taxation without representation. I mean, to take it back to the point you were trying to direct us to a couple of minutes ago, Chris, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 established, among other things, through John Locke's Second Treatise on Government, which served to help justify, deposing James II and installing William and Mary on the British throne. He said, why do we have government in the first place? We have government to protect individual rights, and that, chiefly these are life and liberty and property. And, what do you call it when someone reaches into your pocket without asking and they take your money? That's stealing. So, taxation without representation is exactly the opposite of what any government should do. And I would say too, I'd push back a little bit on something that you seem to imply when you said that the colonists were happy to accept British help and aid in the prosecution of the French and Indian War. There's truth to that, but it's also true, and we shouldn't overlook the fact that Americans are contributing mightily to this war themselves. Something like a third of the men of Massachusetts, put on uniforms and leave the colony of Massachusetts to fight in the French and Indian Wars. That's an incredible degree of mobilization.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, I guess I was trying to suggest that from the British point of view, they thought the Americans, right? But that's their point about the cost and the effort from American colonists during that war was significant as well. So we've got a couple of great questions coming in. One's just a clarification. Sarah asked, could you repeat your numbers on those taxes again, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my source is the Blackwell Companion to the American Revolution. They have a great article on sort of finance in there. And the number for 1763 is 384,000 pounds spent by the British on the American colonies and 1,800 pounds collected in revenue by the British from the American colonies.
Wow. Okay. Amazing. Yeah, quite a difference. So you wonder why they persisted. And of course, I guess the answer is, well, they did back off occasionally, right, in the light of some of these things.
Sure.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things, I think, too. One of the other questions that popped up here in the chat box was one that asked about the continuity or the turnover in British administrations with prime ministers. Because as Rob noted, I mean, the British tried a lot of different things to try to raise revenue from the colonists. And the one thing they had in common was really none of them worked. I mean, the Stamp Act was a complete failure from the standpoint of raising any substantial revenue. The Townshend duties were at best partially successful. But again, I mean, these were not the kinds of measures developed in the kinds of ways that could really generate a revenue from the colonies anywhere close to what the British needed. So it's true that the British backed down and repealed the Stamp Act, later repealed the Townshend duties except the one on tea, and there's the changeover from Grenville to Townsend to North, on and on and on. But the one problem, the one constant for the British is they had the problem after 1763 of how to gain more revenue to pay for the war debt and to pay for the ongoing cost of administering the colonies. And that was a problem they could just never, ever solve. Every measure they tried failed at its most basic level. I mean, a revenue measure is designed to gain revenue, and when revenue measures don't do that, they are failures, in addition to being incredibly unpopular and driving away the colonies. And as Rob noted, within about a dozen years, the British lost the great prize they had won in North America. And this is one of the classic examples of irony and unintended consequences that are so typical throughout history.
Yeah, oh, that's a great point. Hey, kind of a related question that since you brought that, I was going to bring that question up too, Todd. I'm glad you did. But maybe a related question is somebody asked about the effect of salutary neglect in the years preceding the change that happens after 1763. So how does that affect? I guess maybe what I'm working toward is this sort of split in the minds of Englishmen living in America and Englishmen who are living back in England.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, the salutary neglect in some ways, I guess, and some scholars are arguing, is kind of in the minds of the beholder. It's sort of a great way to summarize in a general sense how Parliament and how the British treated the American colonists prior to 1763. But of course, that also sort of leaves out the idea that there was a fair amount of regulation, obviously, concerning trade, concerning commerce. The various stages and implementations of the Navigation Acts did very much control where Americans could trade, how they could trade, where they could go, which markets were open. So it's not as if the colonists were left alone, neglected in that sense. Although it is certainly very, very true that there was no effort to impose external taxes on them of the kind that you saw after 1765, and really almost no effort to meddle in colonial affairs prior to that time. But certainly there is enough of a change in British policy being hands-on, and as Rob said, coming into your pocket and taking your money, that changed after 1763 to really make it very, very clear that there was a huge difference in behavior. So if salutary neglect is maybe not a perfect or perfectly apt description of what happened prior to 1763, it's very, very clear there was a change after that date in British policy toward the colonists. And that's one of the reasons why the colonists reacted as they did, because this was so new and so foreign, and they couldn't understand how they, as good, loyal British subjects, could be treated this way, or in their minds mistreated this way. So, in many ways, I guess, Loyalists in 1763, 1764 included nearly everybody in the colonies, the American colonies. But that pool of people who considered themselves Loyalists kept shrinking after that, in many ways because of British policies, obviously, and because of the debates that engendered within the American colonies.
Oh,
just to put, maybe an exclamation point after Todd's statement, I think, it's worth saying, and I'm not the first person to say this, we in America were much better at being British than the people in Britain were. We really believed the foundational principles that undergird the modern British system. The principles of 1688 were the principles that were the basis, the foundation of our argument. And so, in the run-up to the American Revolution, in the decade or so before 1776, we felt like we were the British Patriots. We felt like we were the people who were essentially holding up, the British Constitution and saying we need to live according to this, set of principles. And so the people we considered to be in a state of betrayal to Great Britain were oftentimes the people in control of Parliament.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm often struck by how strongly so many people we think of as patriots start making the argument that they, in fact, are the true Englishmen. The people in England have deviated from their own constitutional traditions, not just stretching back to 1688, but I know there's quite a few writings going all the way back to their Saxon foundations, right?
Sure.
Jefferson, I think, in the Summer Review in '74 mentions the traditions of British constitutionalism stretching from their Saxon origins. There are a number of other writings. So yeah, that argument that we're the true Englishmen, we're the ones who are sticking to the true principles of English constitutionalism, becomes really prominent at the time. So that raises another question. Maybe we can talk about now or at some point. What arguments did the other side make to say we're the true sort of heirs and preservers of British constitutionalism? And I also want to point out there are a number of, you guys have both raised some interesting questions in your descriptions of things. A number of good questions having to do with sort of hypotheticals. James asked, what if the colonists had been given their representation in Parliament? Would that really have given that much of a say, but wouldn't have taken away one of the arguments that the rebels or patriots were prominently or consistently making? And Ray asked, what do you think the British could have done? What adjustments could they have made to hold on to the colonies? So a couple of big questions have been raised by both of your descriptions of these things. So thoughts on any of that?
Well, it's a great question to ask, how, could the British have avoided this dilemma of pushing the colonies away? And it's in many ways hard to see how, because of their understanding of the British Empire and the supremacy of Parliament, which would simply not jibe with the idea of the colonial legislatures, as they later stated, being the equal of Parliament. And one of the documents we can talk about in a little bit is that Joseph Galloway Plan of Union that states very clearly that there will be colonial legislatures and Parliament, but he says their relation to Parliament will be, quote, an inferior and distinct branch of the British legislature. And again, that's the Loyalist position. That's also the English position. But again, I think that the British position there is really a very striking one that just doesn't allow for the kind of recognition of colonial rights and power to tax or legislate or anything else that the colonists could be comfortable with, that would fit with their understanding of what rights English citizens had. So I think given that problem, the idea of having, this idea of virtual representation, to answer the other question, I think, that's something that made sense to Great Britain. And if you believe the Parliament represents for the entire empire across the globe, then the colonists fit in there. But the colonists said, no, we should have actual representation. That's not something that the British were ever willing to do, and really couldn't do that without making an enormous concession. So it's hard to see, I think, in many ways, how this coming split could have been avoided. Maybe it would have come a little earlier, a little later, but I don't know, given all the factors in play, that it really could have been avoided for very long.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was going to make it's almost that distinction is unavoidable given the simple geographical and political circumstances of the fact that you have British in a motherland and people who claim to be British in a colony, right? That motherland or homeland colony distinction seemed to be unavoidable. So at one point, did Americans or British and American in the American colonies initially, did anybody make the argument that the Parliament should legislate for Great Britain proper, and the colonial legislature should be able to legislate for the colonies? Did anybody ever make that distinction?
Many people made that distinction. Todd sort of alluded to it earlier, but when they looked at taxes, what they objected to were internal taxes that aimed, specifically at raising revenue from the American colonists. They thought that only their own parliaments, their own colonial assemblies should have that power. What they didn't object to were British measures that sometimes used taxes as a tool for regulating trade within the empire. Once you got out into the ocean, once you got beyond the borders of the colonies accepted that, yes, this was the rightful realm for Parliament to act. So I have to say, I'm not sure that I agree with the two of you about the inevitability of all of this. I think that had we maintained the status quo that we had enjoyed prior to the French and Indian War, that it would have been possible for the colonies to remain in a relationship with Great Britain. It might have been possible too, say in 1764, for Joseph Galloway's Plan of Union to have been accepted. I'm not sure that it would have been. We know, that Ben Franklin had a Plan of Union that he proposed in 1754 that would have united the colonies in a very loose way with a very, minimal extra layer of government that would allow them to coordinate, their militias to help better project the interests of the British Empire and to jointly negotiate treaties of trade with Native American nations. And the colonies were not excited about that. They didn't want to give up any of their autonomy. So I'm not saying that Galloway's 1774 Plan of Union would have been a slam dunk in 1764, but I think it would have been at least imaginable. I should point out, too, if people are scratching their heads, I don't believe that Galloway's Plan of Union was one of the 4 documents that they were asked to read, but it immediately follows the 4 documents you were asked to read in the Documents and Debates volume. So essentially, it calls for this union of the colonies underneath the British Parliament, but it lays out, exactly what our various responsibilities will be. If Galway, is proposing this to the Continental Congress in 1774, he's going to end up being a loyalist. But just by reading this document and this Plan of Union, by no means is it clear that he is not going to be a patriot. I'll say one other thing, Chris, in response to an earlier hypothetical question. Is there any way that the British could have kept us within the empire if they had given us, representation? I assume that the representation that they would offer would be proportional. And if that were to be the case, then perhaps Americans would have accepted that offer. But they would have accepted it knowing, as Ben Franklin did. I mean, he did the math that it was only a matter of time for us to outnumber the people of Great Britain. And so the empire essentially would have transferred from one side of the Atlantic to the other. I don't think the British ever had any intention of doing that. And even if they did, I think you would still find many people in America saying that it's just not practical for us to be represented on the other side of the ocean. The amount of time it takes for information to cross, to go back and forth, and the propensity for Americans, let's say, to go native if they were to reside in London and lose touch with, we hear about this about politicians today. They go off to Washington, D.C., and they forget about where they come from. Right. I think, that would have been an objection as well. So we can't definitively say that there was no alternative or that this was inevitable. But I do think that certainly we know what did happen. And with 2020 hindsight, the British course of action really seems self-defeating.
Can I ask, in light of that's all fascinating, can I ask in light of that another question? And Candy's question made me think of this. She mentions Thomas Jefferson's Summer Review, and the line that he puts in there about being a free British inhabitant. Where's her question? She mentions that on page 68, Jefferson reflects on being a free British inhabitant with the right to leave by chance or not so on and so forth, right? And Candy suggests that this is kind of one of Jefferson's subtle, maybe not so subtle, but sort of proddings of the king to remind the king that, that there's a lot more at stake here. But I'm trying to be clear here for a second. Do people like Jefferson and others really want representation in Parliament? It seems to me, again, when you read that Summer Review by Jefferson, he's not calling for separation, and he's doing his best to make himself sound like a good British subject, right? But my suspicion, maybe both of you who are very familiar with Jefferson, written on Jefferson, can say whether you think Jefferson really, really wanted Parliament or representation in Parliament, or would that have sort of potentially pulled the rug out from his ultimate goal of separation and independence, if in fact that was his ultimate goal? I guess my question is, what did Jefferson want out of all of this? What did he want to happen?
Todd, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to say, actually, Rob should take this. Rob has written, as people may know, a great book called Confounding Father, which is about Thomas Jefferson. And I think it's recently out in paperback as well, so it's not particularly expensive. But it's a great book and a great read. And so Rob has really studied very closely Thomas Jefferson and his revolutionary thinking. So I've got a few things I would like to add to this, but I want to hear from Rob first, actually.
Yeah,
well, Todd, you're such a great friend, not only to give me the question, but to plug my book.
Yeah, there you go.
Thanks so much. Yeah. So I guess whenever you would hear just about anyone saying no taxation without representation, the part that they really meant was no taxation. They really weren't calling for representation. They were quite happy with the system that they had been enjoying, for dozens of decades.
Yeah.
And, when Jefferson writes the summary view, it is in some ways a statement of loyalty, but it's clearly a thinly veiled threat as well. And, for me, the most stirring part of that document is when he writes about the origins of what would become the British North American colonies. And he points out that, it's not like the Apollo 11 moon landing where, the United States taxpayer through the United States government, funded this expedition to plant the flag on the moon. Jamestown, Plymouth, these were private ventures organized voluntarily by corporations. And as Jefferson points out on page 69, America was conquered and her settlements made and firmly established at the expense of individuals and not of the British public. Their own blood was spilt in acquiring lands for their settlement, their own fortunes expended in making that settlement effectual. For themselves they fought, for themselves they conquered, and for themselves alone they have right to hold. In other words, we founded ourselves, and we voluntarily extended our loyalty to the British Crown. But because we voluntarily decided to be loyal to the British Crown, that means that we can voluntarily withdraw that loyalty from the British Crown.
But even that argument's pretty radical, right? I mean, even at the time that it's made.
Sure.
I mean, it seems radical, but that's an amazing argument. Todd, you said, thank you, Rob. Todd said he wanted to jump in on
a couple things about it. I think it's very important here to note the chronology of when this comes and what the summary review does and doesn't do. I mean, it's clearly not a Declaration of Independence. However, it does define, often very sharply, as Rob noted, the American position. And that's one of the things about this document that I think is striking too, the number of times that American appears as an adjective in this to describe something. There are references, I'll just look at a few things I've circled. American story, American public, American states, American affairs, American art, sort of on and on. I mean, all of these are Jefferson's way of describing something that is unique to a people, even if there's not yet an American nation. And I think he's very clearly defining what I think in many ways had been what Americans had long thought were, in fact, British principles that the British seem to have been moving away from. Mm-hmm. And I think he's trying to, in this summary view, redefine these as American positions and American principles and American ideas. But it does show, I think, very clearly how, in summarizing American public opinion, if we can take it as a summary view of that, by August of 1774, there's not yet the move to independence. I mean, the war has not started yet. And of course, Paine's Common Sense won't come until January of 76, and the Second Continental Congress, and then independence. In one of the later paragraphs here, I think there's a key phrase that Jefferson uses that sort of blows out of the water a document that will come a month later, which is Galloway's Plan of Union, where Jefferson writes, this is in the paragraph that begins, that these are our grievances we have thus laid before His Majesty. A few lines further down from that, Jefferson writes, let no act be passed by any one legislature which may infringe on the rights and liberties of another, which again seems to be very clearly a way of equating the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Massachusetts Assembly, the New York legislature with Parliament. Yeah. So that's a conception of empire that the British will clearly never accept. They have rejected that. They cannot accept that and still keep their idea of the empire together. And so I think Jefferson here is less declaring independence, but more, even more so, I think, just spelling out principles and ideas and summarizing where Americans are. There is still hope, and there will obviously be hope even as late as the Olive Branch petition, late in 1775, that the colonists can somehow go over the head of Parliament to the king and say to the king, look, get rid of your corrupt ministers. We love you. We know you want us to succeed. Can't we just find some way to get around Parliament? And of course, the king is unwilling to do that. So, I think this is a key document, but I think it's a great document to think about because it doesn't do what the Declaration does, obviously. It also doesn't do what common sense does, but it does, I think, kind of lay the groundwork for that. And it suggests, again, why every single year, and I think in some degree, almost every single month between 74 and 76 is really crucial to the events that will bring about the revolution.
That's great. Hey, just for clarification, so that Jefferson's summary view, my understanding correct that is a draft Jefferson wrote that to the delegates in Congress from Virginia as a suggestion for what they should write or what they should put before the king. Should they put together some sort of petition or some sort of list of grievances? Is that the context of that document? Do either of you know? That was my understanding.
It's kind of an interesting story, Chris. Jefferson was famously a bad public speaker. And,
right.
He wrote this as a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And this was going to be his suggestion that the Burgesses approve this and send it, to Congress. But as he, was riding toward Williamsburg, he was stricken with dysentery. And so he gave the draft to a messenger and sent it forward, and he turned around and went back home. And I think it's at least possible that the fact that it wasn't Jefferson standing there reading this to the House of Burgesses, but instead someone else that might result in the fact that it received the attention that it did, even though it was considered too radical for the House of Burgesses to adopt it.
So nothing really directly came out of that in Congress. Although I think as Todd was suggesting, I think you can see sort of tones of it that come out later in the Olive Branch petition, which I think Jefferson also helped draft, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong about that, but then I'm thinking also about the later Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, where you see some of this language, I think, at least in tone or spirit, emerge. But of course, by that point, the shooting had started, so it's a different set of circumstances. But this is all great, really fascinating. There's a quick follow-up to a point that you made earlier, Rob, where you were saying that for some Americans or some people living in America, taxation without representation really meant no taxation. Just as a quick follow-up, Scott asked, what was the tax differential between English in Great Britain and the American colonies? Do we know? Was there a big difference? And the second part of this question is, why did Americans feel they should pay less in taxes than those living in Great Britain?
So I've heard different numbers bandied about, and I wish I could seize upon those sources and quote them to you and analyze where they get their tabulations. But I've heard that the tax burden upon the average British person was something like 20% of his income. Ours, meanwhile, was much lower than that. Wow. But I think that we believe that there's no reason why we should contribute to the internal maintenance of the British Isles. And I think we also believed that as free people, we did contribute to the French and Indian War. Our legislatures sent forth troops. It paid them, it equipped them, it put them in uniforms. That was a burden upon us as well. So I don't know that there was much of an argument being made within the colonies for higher taxes. You don't really see much of that.
Yeah, right. Fair enough. There were a couple. We've got so many good questions. Maybe Todd, if you wanted to comment on this, a couple of them have to do with you brought up the Galway Plan a couple of times. A couple of questions have to do with the differences between the colonies, and one of them asked about the colonies off of East and West Florida. Why did they stay so staunchly loyalist? Was this solely economic, or was there something more existential, which is a great word? And another question had to do with, see if I can find it, had to do with This is from Stan, were the differences in the creation of the colonies, royal, proprietary charters, so on and so forth, too great to develop a true plan of union at this sort of early stage of the Revolution? Any thoughts on the differences between the colonies and how this affected how we thought about these questions?
Yeah, I think early on, I mean, in the 17th century, I think those differences, not only in terms of how they were founded, proprietary, royal, whatever else, but just the very different nature of those colonies, how they made money, what their economy was based on, who settled there, the degree or lack thereof of internal governing structures. I think all those things made a great difference in the colonies and gave them not a tremendous amount in common with each other. Those, over time, I think those differences tended to smooth out because of intercolonial trading, as well as death rates that began to decline, education rates that began to increase, a settled population that began to grow, and the establishment of a number of internal institutions of all kinds of political, legal, social, cultural, religious. I think all those things tended to minimize to a great degree, or at least sand the rough edges off the differences between the colonies. So I'm not sure that the way in which they were founded had, by the time we're talking about here, the 1750s and 60s and 70s, all that big a difference between the colonies, at least where it couldn't prevent collective action of some kind. But I think, again, the bigger concern was again, where did the colonists fit within the British Empire? And the question about the Floridas, I don't know anything, I don't have a specific answer to that, but I would bring up another key point here that scholars have certainly emphasized, and that is the intense interest of European nations, not just the British in North America. The French had obviously been defeated, but the Spanish had an enormous interest and presence in North America.
Oh, that's a great point.
And so you've got this sort of imperial battle. I mean, we tend to think, and actually for a long time, the historical scholarship actually tended to reflect this idea that it was very much the British versus the American colonists, and that's all there was in the world at that time. And of course, we know it was very much the case that there were other nations, other empires, other economic interest in North America, other military interest in North America, other settlements in North America, plus, of course, still fairly sizable groups of Native Americans. So those were all some of the various factors going on that sort of complicated the picture. And I think that sort of broader imperial understanding of North America and what happened may well explain why people in different areas were pulled one way or another, or had, conflicted loyalties or divided loyalties, or things like that. It's a very, very messy reality, I think, as history. I think Rob would probably agree with this. History is usually pretty messy. I mean, we tend to define it and explain it in ways that make sense. And I think the explanation of the revolution as being this battle between patriots and loyalists, that's a part of it, obviously, but there's a lot more that's going on. And I think the fuller understanding is something that historians, to this day are still writing about and thinking about, and still considering the various impact of all these different angles and things that are pushing on Joseph Galloway and on Thomas Jefferson and on these revolutionary crowds that are turning out and drinking toast to the empire. I mean, there's a lot going on that they're aware of that we sometimes tend to forget about or minimize, but was very, very real to them.
Those are points. Great points.
I think Todd is exactly right, and I love his comment about history being messy. I think you could imagine a hilarious comedy routine called the Obsessive Compulsive Historian. It'd be very, very difficult. But I'll just add one thing more. When we think about the British North American colonies, we tend to focus obviously on the 13 that joined hands and declared independence together in 1776. But of course, there's also Canada. And there are also the British possessions in the Caribbean. And it's worth pointing out that, one reason why I think we don't see the same interest in resistance from the British Caribbean colonies is that they had an enslaved population that outnumbered the white population on average by a factor of 4 to 1. On some islands, it was as many as 16 or 18 to 1. And when you consider that in the Caribbean, they're harvesting sugarcane, and that you harvest sugarcane with a machete, you can understand why British people living in the Caribbean wouldn't want to rock the boat and bring about any additional instability.
That's a great point too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that ties into Gouverneur Morris's comment too. I mean, I think he's less worried about violence necessarily, but just about this. What's he call it? The unfeeling, the unthinking mob. They begin to, come out in the sun and ride around like a snake or something. That same sort of thing is, if we stir this up, we're really stirring up something that we may not be able to control. Whoever we is, whether it's Parliament or elites in the colonies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love how he uses this term. Instead of nobility, he refers to the mob as the mobility, the mobility, and it probably brings us to another point. I mean, Todd mentioned earlier that there was this transition from people considering themselves Whigs to considering themselves Republicans. That is, people who were not monarchists. I think we're not yet at the point where many Americans transition to small d Democrats. In other words, democracy, as we understand it, and a large-scale trust and faith in the will of the people is something that is just beginning to emerge in 1774, and that many people still are very much concerned that it is important to have a balanced constitution where some people who own property and who are self-sufficient and able to support themselves and be mentally and economically independent, where they would have a voice. But there aren't many people at this point who are arguing for things like, universal suffrage, even just for white men. That's still a ways off.
All great points. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of factors that go into this question. And on that messiness of the thing, that reminds me there were a couple of questions. Let's see if I can find it here. Somebody wrote, I get the sense from the readings that a person can be both a patriot and a loyalist. Do you think that this is a struggle that the men of the time fought about with themselves, perhaps? And I raise that because it seems like in this, there must have been quite a number of people that were sort of torn very deeply over this question, right? So we tend to think, well, they're the patriots and the loyalists, and they're separate, but there must have been a lot of people that thought they could be both or struggled to be both somehow and maybe reconcile the two. And it calls to mind, I don't know that we actually recommended these readings, or the reading by Gage, by the way, I think that's in the Reader, which I think is also really interesting and worth reading. Somebody mentioned Edmund Burke's attempts in Parliament. That's not part of the readings, but Edmund Burke tried to bring about a kind of reconciliation between the way the British mind worked and the American mind worked. So, can either of you comment on, I guess, I guess what I'm hoping for is maybe how did those who chose to stay loyal to the British government, if you will, how did they work through some of these issues, or vice versa?
Yeah, well, I mean, that leads us to one of the summarizing points about this whole webinar is, how do we today think about the Loyalists? How do we understand them? And one way to think about them is to see them as tragic figures in many ways, that they were people who did their best to be loyal to an idea and to a system that was changing before their very eyes in ways they didn't fully understand. Bernard Bailyn, the early American historian, has a famous book from 1975, I think it is, called The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts. And it's a very sympathetic book because he really tries to understand, why would someone be a loyalist and why would someone persist in that kind of behavior? And it's again, I think it's a very sympathetic book that sort of sees Hutchinson's case as being tragic. He's just not able to make that mental leap into something different than he's known. And I think the Loyalists, if we think about them, they clearly lost in the Revolution. They lost their property. They were forced to flee to Canada, to Nova Scotia. But they've also really never had a revival, if you will. I mean, if we think about this as being the first American Civil War, you can make the argument, as scholars have done, that the Confederates in 1861-65, the rebels of the Second American Civil War, have been treated far better retrospectively than the Loyalists have. I mean, there's a lot that goes on, obviously, with race and slavery connected to that. But there's also been, I think, a kind of reconciliation, that famous 1913 attempt to unite Confederate and Union armies at Gettysburg. and sort of have a reconciliation between the regions of the veterans who fought at Gettysburg, that suggests a real way to try to recombine and bring people back together. I'm not sure the Loyalists have ever really been united or reunited in some way or written back into the American story. And I think that's one of the things that I think complicates our way of how do we think about them today, how do we teach about them. For those of us who, as I think all of us do, teach classes on the Revolution, how do we think about them? How do we fit them into the story? And what do we do with them? I mean, they're clearly dissenters in the revolutionary conflict, but is there some way of, fitting them back in, or do we just sort of write them off as, bizarre and on the wrong side? So I think the Balin approach was to sort of take them seriously and sympathetically and to sort of see this as a tragedy of sorts. And that's one way of getting at it, but it's clearly not the only way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It is such a tragedy for the Loyalists. They want so much to believe that Great Britain will come to its senses and embrace the principles that caused them to love Great Britain in the first place. I mean, in a sense, they don't disagree with the Patriots on anything except about the necessity of jumping ship and establishing our own independent government. And it's really tragic. You brought up, Chris, the Olive Branch petition, which, John Dickinson took the lead in writing. And he, of course, is in 1775 and 1776, certainly not on the side of independence. And, he's given this task. Okay, write a petition directly to the king, pleading with him to recognize our rights. And Dickinson, accepts this task and sends it to the king, and the petition is rebuffed. The British don't even want to consider anything that comes from this extra legal body, the Continental Congress. They don't even recognize its legitimacy. So of all the enemies of the Loyalists, I think you can make the argument that ultimately the greatest and the most devastating was the British government itself. Yeah. And to find ourselves in a state of war with Great Britain, even before independence, seriously undermines the Loyalist case. And, one thing we haven't mentioned is, I think maybe once or twice the term has come up, but we haven't discussed the coercive acts or the intolerable acts as they were known. And, these are passed in response to the Boston Tea Party in early 1774, and they shut down Boston Harbor. They outlaw local town meetings in Massachusetts. They make it so that the Massachusetts legislature can't meet except to discuss how to pay back the British for the tea that was thrown overboard. When you can't make laws under which you live, you're not an Englishman. People oftentimes in this period would say that the British are trying to enslave us. They would compare our treatment to that of people who were enslaved. You also see people at this point saying that the British are treating us not like Englishmen, but like Irishmen, like a conquered people, as if we are in a state of war with them. In fact, Patrick Henry in 1774 said, "We are in a state of nature." In other words, it's almost as if the British government has declared independence from us and no longer performs the essential functions of a government, protecting rights to life and liberty and property, and is now, like a barbarian in the state of nature, putting those rights in danger and under attack. So I feel sorry for the Loyalists because they really wanted to believe that the British government would come around and see the light, and ultimately it was the British government that disappointed them more than anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you brought up Dickinson too. I was going to bring up Dickinson. I'm glad you did, because I get that the question comes up in my when I teach the American founding course. Was Dickinson a Loyalist or a Patriot? And to straddle both of those views very carefully. Sorry, Todd, I didn't mean to cut you off. You wanted to jump in, I think, on that.
No, I was just going to say, I think Rob made some really good points there about that. And I think, again, what all this points up is just how it's very important to pay attention to change over time during this decade, for a decade plus, from 1763 to 1776. There's a lot that changes on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think as you go through the process, then the sides really harden. I mean, the American Patriot side begins to coalesce and harden around certain key ideas. And every time there's a source of conflict, a new law, a new regulation, the protest by the colonists, especially in Massachusetts, every time you have an incident of that, it tends to further polarize and harden those sides. And at a certain point, it becomes difficult to sit down and talk honestly and openly, you might say, without the knowledge on both sides of everything that has transpired in the previous year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. And I think that cumulative effect of that change over time itself contributes to perceptions and the way that people think about these questions on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think it's a vast issue, and I think it's something that, again, we're 200 plus years since this event, 240 some years after the event, and there's still how many books every year appear on the American Revolution? In fact, there's some great recent books that I haven't read or read all of yet by people like Robert Parkinson, The Common Cause, and Eric Nelson, The Royalist Revolution, and Justin Du Rivage, I think it is, called Revolution Against Empire, I think is the title. So some really good recent work that just suggests how fresh and new and always vital these kinds of things are for early American historians.
Yeah, fantastic points. We're rapidly approaching the end of our time. Here's an interesting question from Candy, who asks, this may be a strange question, but she asked about Franklin and his son. Another interesting case of a patriot, a loyalist. Why didn't his son step away from what he could surely see was about to take place? Does anybody know, have any insight on Franklin and the situation that split between his son? I'm sure both of you do, but or is this just a case of, again, just sort of summarizing some of the distinctions we've been making, right? I mean, Franklin makes a decision that the cause of the Patriot cause is the right cause. His son sees the British Empire or remaining loyal to the British government a matter of not just necessity, perhaps, but also as, again, the right thing to do. I guess any thoughts on the Franklin situation? Or?
Well, I think it just shows how divisive these questions could be within families, because the Franklin family was obviously not the only one that was split by this, but it was not a matter of this group and that group, but sometimes divided families against each other in this way. Yeah,
Stan mentions Gouverneur Morris, I think, and his family were also divided. That raises another question about I wanted to ask about the treatment of loyalists in America, if you don't mind. Did the treatment of loyalists by patriots change after the shooting started in 1775? How were people who were, again, loosely understood loyalists treated or viewed before and after the shooting actually started in 1775?
So Todd brought up Rob Parkinson's great book, The Common Cause, and one of the central arguments that Rob Parkinson makes is one of the ways that we forged unity among the American patriots was by establishing, who the others were, who was outside of our circle. And obviously, loyalists were a prime target to be outside of that circle. And the mistreatment of them, I suppose you could describe it that way, began maybe long before independence, when people resisted efforts to protest the Stamp Act or the Townsend Duties, for example. People who collaborated with the British, people who agreed to pay their taxes, people who didn't observe boycotts of taxed goods would oftentimes be ostracized or shunned. People would refuse to do business with them. Sometimes you would see people hanged in effigy. Sometimes you would see people tarred and feathered. So it wasn't easy to stand outside of the circle of, and I think it was a growing circle of American patriots who were highly critical of British policy. And then finally, after 1776, so critical that, they were willing to declare independence from Britain itself. And, it's not for no reason that so many loyalists are going to decide that they need to pick up and move and, go to Canada or go back to Great Britain. I think it's also worth pointing out that, these categories are fluid and that a lot of people who consider themselves, in 1763, 100% of the American population, I think it's fair to say, there might be a rounding error, but was in the Loyalist camp. By 1783, when the War for Independence came to a close, a much smaller percentage was in the Loyalist camp. I mean, this was a process of conversion, and people converted for a whole bunch of different reasons. Sometimes out of principle, I think oftentimes out of principle, oftentimes out of, the experience of observing British imperial policy or observing during the war British troops. who did not seem like they were protecting us, but instead seemed like they had come to conquer us. Certainly, there were people who essentially raised the white flag and decided that they were going to quiet down and accept the status quo and try to get along peacefully with their neighbors, and that's how they ended up on the Patriot side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also didn't. There were some efforts, I believe, especially by Washington, kind of as a military necessity, to grant amnesty to certain loyalists. Was this in New Jersey in particular, as a sort of campaign measure? Wasn't Washington in favor of sort of granting amnesty to loyalists as a way to sort of win over their loyalty to the new United States and lure them away from the British? I seem to recall reading something about that. And there was a lot of opposition to that, if I remember correctly, in Congress when Washington suggested that we should welcome loyalists, show them that they can be part of our sort of new, American family. But anyway, I mentioned that perhaps in part to show just how divisive, again, this issue remained through the Revolution. But
well, I can speak to a subsequent case immediately after the War for Independence, when the British evacuated New York City. There was the question about what to do with the loyalists who remain behind, who don't leave with the British, and especially what to do with their property. And this came up, not only in New York, but in Virginia and other places. And these colonies, now states, were strapped for cash. And many looked at loyalist property as a potential source of revenue and a way to finance the war. Alexander Hamilton, I think to his credit, after the war in New York, pushed back really hard against plans to confiscate loyalist property, and was trying to make the argument that, property rights, among other things, were why we fought this war in the first place. And if these people are going to remain among us, and if these people are going to be able to, join our ranks as patriots, we need to make sure that we respect their rights as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just very briefly, one of the great movements that begins even before the revolution is over, the war and the revolution is over, is an attempt to try to contain the revolution. And that's particularly true on the part of people who became Federalists in the debate over the Constitution, and certainly among people like Hamilton, like Gouverneur Morris, who were also Federalists in the 1790s. They're really trying to roll this back and say, no, it's about independence, about separation, but it's not about this sort of vast democratizing of the country. So there is a real effort, even before the war is over, to try to contain it and limit what the revolution was and was not about.
Wow, that's a fascinating point. And Todd, the time has just flown by. We're actually over time, but that is a great segue to our next Saturday webinar on the great American debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So hopefully that will come up in our next webinar. But gentlemen, again, we're over, and I'm sorry I've kept you longer than planned. But I really appreciate your insights into this. I've learned a great deal. I hope others have found this useful. But again, thank you very much. This is very, very pleasant and thoughtful.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a pleasure.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Todd. It was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I wish we had another 2 hours to keep going, but I know you're both busy as well. So thank you both again. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. Thanks for submitting great questions. Just a quick reminder about the email you'll receive with your link for a certificate of participation. One last plug. Read both of these fine scholars' books. They're not only full of great information, but just great to read, pleasant to read, not sort of acutely, what's the word I'm looking for? Some people write these overly scholarly, what's the term people use, egg-headed books or something like that. These guys write great books, both of them, and they're pleasant to read. So can't recommend their works highly enough. And happy to say that both of them teach regularly in our master's program here at Ashland as well. So thanks again, gentlemen. Look forward to seeing you both in whenever it is we're going to get together in Virginia in October.
Yes.
I think.
Can't wait.
That's it.
Okay, great. So one last mention again about our next Saturday webinar. It will be September 8th. And again, we'll be looking at the great American debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So hopefully you can join us again then. Until then, take care and thanks.